Welcome to lesson number 7 in our series entitled Let's Take Another Look, Passages from the Old Testament. Today we look at David versus Goliath, found in 1 Samuel chapter 17. But first, a little bit of background. The people of Israel had asked for a king. God had told them that they didn't need a king because he had and would continue to protect them. He reminded them of all that he had already done for them, and yet they insisted on an earthly king who would lead them into battle on that battle horse as they had seen other nations' kings do. And so Samuel told them that if they insisted on having a king, here are some of the things that would happen. And he said, the king will take your sons as soldiers. He will take your crops to feed himself and those appointed to serve him. He would take their daughters as wives and concubines and servants, just like other kings of the earth did. And of course, what we see is that the kings did all of this and actually much more. But in the eyes of the people of Israel, they were now in good shape because they had a king and they were just like the other nations, which is what they said. And they were given a king, and the first king of Israel was a man named Saul. Now, it has to be said that Saul certainly looked like a king. He looked the part. He is mentioned as standing a head taller than everybody else. And the other descriptions given of him is that he kind of looks like what you would think of when you think about a king in terms of his size and his handsomeness and all the different things. He fit the part, in other words, as they envisioned it. So even though Saul was from one of the smaller tribes, from the tribe of Benjamin, a tribe with very little influence, he was chosen to be the first king of Israel. But it didn't take too long before Saul fell out of favor with God. He looked the part, but he didn't live the part. Saul disobeys God early on, and though in some ways the disobedience seems small, the little things start to add up. God tells Saul, for example, to kill all of the Amalekites when they engage in battle, but Saul spares King Agag, which was a common custom and courtesy of warfare in that day in terms of how you treated rulers of other nations. But that's not what God had told him to do. God commands all of the livestock to be killed, but Saul keeps back the best of the livestock for himself and kills the rest. Also, these little bits of disobedience on the small things lead to disobedience on the big things. Because God knows that if Saul decides for himself what to obey and what to disobey, then it wouldn't take too long before Saul would be regularly disobeying God. And indeed, Saul even goes and consults with an oracle instead of fully trusting in God. So the time comes after this that God rejects Saul as king, though Saul will still be a king for quite a while after this time. Saul is still king, but in the midst of that, God sends Samuel to the home of Jesse, where God will reveal the next king. God chooses David, the youngest of Jesse's children, to be the next king. Now, David, in contrast with Saul, does not look like a king. He's small. He's the youngest of the children. And although it does say that he was ruddy and handsome, he's smaller than the others, and again, the youngest. But God says to Samuel in 1 Samuel 16:7, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected Saul." The Lord does not look at things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And 1 Samuel 16:13 records that the Spirit of the Lord, quote, came mightily upon David from that day forward. But of course, no one knows that this has taken place. And no one knowing includes Jesse, it includes David, and it includes Saul. So really, Samuel is the only human being who knows what has happened. David and Saul are introduced to each other because David plays the lyre, and the Spirit of the Lord has departed from Saul, and as the Spirit of the Lord departs, an evil spirit torments him. David's playing soothes Saul, and Saul then makes David his armor bearer. But David is still seen as of having such little importance that when the battle between the Philistines and the Israelites breaks out, David is left at home to tend to the sheep. And that brings us to what happens with the story of David versus Goliath. So let's take another look. And we start with 1 Samuel 17, verses 1 through 11. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and formed ranks against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And I'm going to take a break before I continue reading. They believe it's that valley of Elah, and I'd encourage you to pause and go pull up a map of that valley of Elah. Type in site of David versus Goliath, and you'll see a lot of maps that will pop up. So they're on the opposite sides of the mountain with the valley between them. I'm going to pick up reading now in verse 4. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 4 cubits and a span. And I'll take another little pause. Some say 6 cubits and a span, and I'll talk about that in the description in a minute. Back to the reading. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight me and to kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So the Philistines were a constant threat to the people of Israel. The Israelites had regular interaction with the Philistines because they used the Philistines' blacksmiths for the relatively few iron tools that they had. The area of the Philistines was rich in iron ore, but Israel was mainly agriculture. So in the Iron Age, the Philistines were considered quite advanced. Nowadays, we have used that as a pejorative word, kind of to mean backward or unsophisticated or barbaric. But in actuality, in their day and time, they were more advanced in many ways than was Israel, especially technologically. And it was Israel who was viewed as insignificant and weak, at least at this time. It really wasn't until the time of David and part of Solomon that Israel merited much mention in the writings of the surrounding Near East ancient Near East tribes and civilizations. And of the iron tools that they had, the vast majority were farm implements, such as the plows. They had some iron weapons and armor, but not much. And probably only Saul's son Jonathan, and maybe some of the key soldiers, leaders, generals, or whatnot, would have had any metal armor. The rest would have had leather armor, which wouldn't hold up much against those iron swords. The Philistines, by contrast, had plenty of iron weapons and armor for their army. And the Philistines knew that Israel was weaker because they knew how much armor and how many iron swords the Israelites had, because remember, their blacksmiths had made all of those things for them, and they also had spies in Israel. So the story goes into, at this point, great detail about Goliath's great physical size. He's described in an ancient manuscript as 6 cubits and a span, which would be 9 feet 9 inches tall. But in other manuscripts, such as the one I read, and I read the New Revised Standard Translation, as 4 cubits and a span, which would be 6 foot 9 inches tall. Now, while the 9 foot 9 inches tall would make him one of the biggest people to ever live, even the 6 foot 9 inches tall would have been considered huge. The average height of a male in that day and time was 5'5". So think about how 6'9" would have looked at. One of the items that I pulled up for the people when I did the in-person Bible study was a photograph of Shaquille O'Neal, who's between 7 foot and 7'2". Most have him at 7'2". When he weighed his heaviest at like 340 pounds, of him standing next to a man named Muggsy Bogues. And Muggsy Bogues, back in the day, and I think still is the shortest NBA player in NBA history, especially starting player. And it has them standing side by side, and it is absolutely hilarious to see these two NBA players, and to see Shaq, who's not only tall but also is big and wide. When we see the description of Goliath and the type of armor and the greaves and the javelin and the spear and all those things, he's not just like a tall, scrawny guy. He is tall and big. He is massive. And you go back and read how much that was. And even though we don't know what all those weights are, it's hard for us to just read it and translate it. Read about the size of the spear shaft and the head of the spear. And that spear probably was meant for thrusting and not for throwing. Just the head of the spear, it would have been the modern equivalent of about 15 pounds. Everything mentioned is vastly outsized for the norms of the day. And that added to Goliath's intimidation factor. And so Goliath comes out to make this challenge. And really it wasn't that unusual for the champions of an army to meet in single combat. But usually it didn't determine the entire battle, and usually what Goliath suggests is more of a psychological ploy as opposed to it normally determining the entire battle. But of course, if you had a man the size of Goliath who would have outshined everybody else in their day and time, of course you would try to make this request. You're going to do anything to give yourself an advantage. But then, of course, then it says that they are dismayed and they are very afraid. So now we pick up in verse 12, and David comes on the scene. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man Jesse was already old and advanced in years. The 3 eldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. The name of his 3 sons who went into the battle were Eliab the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand, morning and evening. Jesse said to his son David, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp of your brothers. Also take the 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See how your brothers fare, and bring some token from them." So now we're introduced to David once again. But if you read it, we're introduced to him, if you kind of read through the entire thing, and I would encourage you to go and read throughout this entire story, even starting before 1 Samuel 17. If you go back and read, really, it reads almost as if we're being introduced to David again, even though we've already been introduced to him before. And this is actually his 3rd appearance. Now, there are a variety of opinions on this. Some scholars think that maybe there were some different stories about David that had been written down, and the writer of 1 Samuel just kind of puts them together. And thus, there are 3 different stories that seem to introduce him each time instead of assuming that we know who he is the first time. But then it's just possible that the way that the writer of 1 Samuel is putting it this way to kind of give you a dramatic effect, to almost to say, remember this guy, David, who did these different things, and then this is what we are told. In effect, just to show the difference between mighty Goliath and young and small David. Notice, Goliath comes out every day for 40 days. That number 40 is important. I've talked about it in other lessons and in other studies. 40 is a time of preparation. It's a time of getting ready for what is coming next. So my standard speech on that is that while there's no reason to believe that the 40 isn't a literal number, it's also important to understand that the number 40 is a time of preparation. It's a time of getting ready to deal with whatever is about to happen. 40 years in the wilderness, they go into the land of Canaan. 40 days in the ark, 40 days after, 40 days that it rains, 40 days in the ark after it rains, 40 days in the wilderness that Jesus was tempted, 40 days that Jesus spent with his disciples following the resurrection. It's always getting them ready for what comes next. So Goliath comes out for 40 days and taunts the Israelites, and we'll see more about that. And so I think the main point of it is that God is getting the people ready for this turning point that is about to happen. One is David's about to, is this is a next step in David eventually becoming the king. Remember, Samuel has already decided this. God has already decided this, although nobody else knows it. And so it's getting the people ready and introducing them to David in a particular way. We then pick up at chapter 17, verse 19, and we read through verse 31. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the Israelites, when they saw the man, fled from him and were very much afraid. The Israelites said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. The king will greatly enrich the man who kills him, and will give him his daughter and make his family free in Israel." Now David said to the men who stood by them, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The people answered him in the same way, "So it shall be done for the man who kills him." His eldest brother Eliab heard him talking to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. He said, "Why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil in your heart, for you have come down just to see the battle." David said, "What have I done now? I only asked a question." He turned away from him towards another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and Saul sent for David. So Saul is not up at the encampment of the army right now. He's back at the other headquarters. That's not terribly unusual. Saul is the king. It's too great a risk to be up there. But it's interesting, nobody else will go out there either. They go and they kind of gather, but when Goliath comes out, they flee. We learn that Saul has offered a reward of wealth, freedom, and marriage into the family of the king for anyone who can defeat Goliath. But of course, nobody will go, because what good is having that stuff if there's such a great likelihood that you're going to be killed? Well, David is offended by this blasphemy of God, by this affront to God. Not only is he offended because of the blasphemy of Goliath, but he's also offended because nobody will stand up and defend Israel. Nobody will stand up and defend the God of Israel. Now, I have to offer just a quick little side note, and it has nothing to do with the lesson itself, but I love this interaction between Eliab, who's the oldest, and David, who's the youngest. David's trying to figure out what's going on. He's sent by Jesse to take that stuff to his brothers. Eliab sees this younger brother standing out there around, and he basically says, "Get back to work. You know you're not where you're supposed to be." He scolds him for leaving the flock. He says, "You coming up here was just an excuse to see what's going on." And David's like, "What? I didn't do anything. I was told to come up here. I was just asking a question about what was going on." And I just love that classic older brother, younger brother exchange. It just kind of adds another dynamic to, element to that family dynamic that we see, especially when you think about that David's going to be the one king, not the eldest brother Eliab. And so David kind of gives an indication in the midst of this that he might be willing to go out there and fight Goliath and confront Goliath. Word gets to Saul, and Saul calls David. And remember, he is familiar with David, though he's never seen this side of David before. We then pick up in verse 32, and we'll go through verse 49, which continues on with the story. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant," meaning him, "your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb, and if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them." So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day, to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. He put his hand in a bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank deep into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So let's go back and recap. David states directly to Saul, "I'm willing to fight Goliath." Saul sums up one of the reasons David shouldn't go, things he's heard before. David's just a boy. Goliath has been a warrior most of his life. And I love David's statement of response. That just as God has been with him in the sheep he was tending, just as God has given him the victory over the lion and the bear, that God will give his victory over even this Philistine. Goliath has insulted God, and he should not be allowed to get away with it. And David is convinced that just as God has delivered him before, God will deliver him now. Saul's only reply to such confidence, maybe could be seen as foolhardiness, is to say, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." And while I think that it's an honest sentiment, may the Lord be with you, given the fact that Saul says it after nobody else will step forward, after the only person that steps forward is David, this small man, young boy, it's clear he doesn't really believe that David has a chance. I enjoy kind of a description along those lines. I enjoy watching British TV shows and movies, and sometimes when there's a courtroom drama and a person is sentenced to be executed, the judge will say, he'll pronounce the judgment and say, "May God have mercy on your soul." It's a way of saying we don't have any mercy on you, but maybe God will. And I kind of get that same sentiment. Then go, and may God go with you. It's kind of like, David, you don't have much of a shot. You're probably not going to make it out of this, but God be with you anyway. God bless you, my child, for even going and giving it a try, even though I expect you to die. Saul decides he needs to give David his best shot. It's survival, so he puts the armor on and he puts his helmet on, and it doesn't fit. Saul's bigger than David. It's heavy. David isn't used to it. And so David decides he's going to be true to who he is. And he takes only his sling and 5 smooth stones and runs to battle. David's trust is such that he understands that his best defense is not armor or a helmet or a sword or spear. His best defense is the strength and the presence of the Lord. Well, Goliath takes one look at David, and Goliath now is highly insulted. What are the Israelites, after all, doing by sending a youth with no armor and only a sling, against this giant of a man with armor and a shield and a helmet and a sword and a javelin and a spear. And Goliath curses David, and he curses the God of Israel. David, however, has his own words to speak. David says, "Sure, you have sword and spear and javelin, but I have the presence of Almighty God on my side. And as the old saying goes, God plus one makes a majority, or us plus God makes a majority." In other words, when the Lord is on our side, that's all we need. David shows complete and total confidence in God to deliver him from defeat, to give him victory over Goliath. David is not afraid, but rather sees this battle as an opportunity for God to demonstrate to the Philistines God's power and might. So David runs toward the battle line as Goliath runs towards David. He takes out the sling, puts the stone in his sling, and spins it around and hurls it. The stone hits him right in the forehead. It says the stone sinks into the forehead. You can almost hear that thunk and that crack. Goliath falls face down on the ground dead. After Goliath falls, David rushes forward and cuts off the head of the Goliath. The Philistines turn and run, and it had to be quite a sight to see a young boy kill their great champion with only one rock and then cut off his head. And at that point, the battle turns into a rout as the Israelites drive back the Philistines. Now, as we kind of look back over this story, there are some key messages and points that I think resonate so strongly with us. And I think it's part of the reason we love this story. One, is such a dramatic thing. It's even in common parlance today. Even people who don't know anything about the Bible know that the phrase David versus Goliath means somebody with no odds up going against somebody who's considered to be too powerful. But there are a couple of things in there that I want to highlight. The first is the idea that David gets 5 smooth stones out of the wadi to go to put in the sling, to use in the sling, to go against all of that armor and all those weapons of Goliath. And it looks so incredibly outmatched. And it turns out that they were outmatched. But it was Goliath who was outmatched, not David, because David only needed 1 stone. He didn't even need, and in 5 stones, he only needed 1. The second is this reminder that we can only achieve God-sized feats with the aid of God. The only way that we can follow and achieve these God-sized dreams is with the help of God. If we can do it by ourselves and we don't need God, then it's probably not of great, lasting and eternal value. But we can only do those God-sized things with God's help. But when we do trust in God and we do move forward and we trust in God as David did, God does great things through us. And it is certainly a demonstration that that the worldly way of looking at things, the odds that the world might put on something, don't match and don't fit the way that God works. The third message is a challenging one. And it is that oftentimes we have to be willing to risk ourselves on something we cannot see, on something that may not make much sense, something we cannot do on our own. Because if we can do it on our own, it becomes too easy to take that credit that belongs to God and God alone. There is no doubt that God is the one who accomplishes this great victory. Because although on the face of it, David is no match for Goliath, the reality is that Goliath is no match for God. And David, who acts on behalf of God, who is God's instrument, is the first to recognize that God will be with him. He's the first to proclaim God's victory and that the victory belongs to God when that victory comes. And one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves, and kind of leave you with that for the rest of this time, is to ask yourself, when those times come, in which the odds seem stacked against you, you feel God calling you, you hear that voice of God, you feel that urging to go and do something that you're not even sure is possible. Are you going to be willing to trust that if God calls you to it, God will provide the means and God will bring you through it? Do you trust that God will bring you that God-sized victory, that God-sized deliverance, to make that God-sized impact? Or are you like the rest of Israel? You're dismayed and afraid because the odds look too great. It looks like something that's too big and overwhelming. When we place our trust in God, God never fails us. God always delivers. And then we have that opportunity to achieve that great victory, to know those blessings, and to strengthen that walk with God, the one who owns and to whom all the honor and glory belongs. I hope then pray that you will think about maybe some of those times in your own life where you might have felt the pull of God to call you to do something that you just felt was overwhelming or impossible, and yet God saw you through it and made it happen. When we trust in Him, God does God-sized things through us in our limited fashion to achieve God-sized victories in our lives and in this world. Thank you for joining with me. Next lesson will be one that looks at David, but an entirely different side of David, an entirely different type of story. It's the story of David and Bathsheba, and what David allows to happen, and what David does in his disobedience to God, and how we see God's mercy and accountability and justice in the midst of it. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that you will join me in that next lesson. God bless you and have a wonderful day.